Medicine is one of the few professions where trust isn't optional. Patients allow doctors to access their bodies, their private lives, and sometimes decisions about life and death. That trust usually works, and it is sacred. But history shows us what happens when trust exists without safeguards. Today I want to talk about Harold Shipman and why his case remains one of the most important ethical warnings in modern medicine. Harold Fredrick Shipman was a GP, also known as a general practitioner or family medicine in America, working in England. He qualified in medicine in 1970 and entered general practice shortly thereafter. For most of his career, he worked within the National Health Service, the NHS, providing primary care to patients in Greater Manchester. Shipman practiced as a GP for over 2 decades. He was known to conduct home visits regularly, particularly for elderly patients, and often worked single-handedly rather than in a large group practice. Among many of his patients and colleagues, he was regarded as a competent, dedicated, and professional individual. There were no formal criminal convictions related to patient harm during the majority of his career. But in January 2000, Shipman was convicted at Preston Crown Court of the murder of 15 patients, all of whom were elderly women, and of forging the will of one patient. The court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment with a recommendation that he should never be released. After his conviction, a statutory public inquiry was established to examine the full extent of his actions and the systemic failures that allowed for them to continue. Shipman had unlawfully killed at least 215 patients between 1975 and 1998, over 23 years. This inquiry also stated that the true number of his victims might in fact be higher, as some deaths could not be conclusively examined due to limitations in available evidence. Shipman died by suicide in January 2004 while serving his sentence. What makes this case extremely extraordinary is not the number of victims, but the length of time over which the killings occurred, and the fact that they took place within a routine primary care largely without any detection. The investigation that led to Shipman's demise began in 1998, following the death of one of his patients, Kathleen Grundy. She was an 81-year-old former mayor of Hyde. Shipman certified her death, stating that she had died of natural causes at home. But shortly after her death, her daughter, who was a solicitor, discovered a will that appeared to leave the majority of Mrs. Grundy's estate to Shipman. This will was typed out, unsigned by any witnesses in the usual manner, and was inconsistent with Mrs. Grundy's previous testamentary arrangements. These irregularities raised immediate concerns with her daughter. This will was reported to the police, which prompted a criminal investigation. Handwriting and forensic analysis later demonstrated that the will was in fact forged. And as part of the investigation, police began reviewing other deaths certified by Harold Shipman, particularly among elderly patients who had died at home. Exhumations were authorized, and toxicological testing revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in several of his patients. These findings ultimately led to Shipman's arrest in 1998 and subsequently to a broader criminal inquiry into his practice. Crucially, the public inquiry later established that Shipman has previously been investigated on multiple occasions. In the 1970s, he had been convicted of drug offences related to the misuse of pethidine. In the 1990s, concerns had been raised about high mortality rates and prescribing patterns in his practice, but these investigations did not result in any decisive action. The failure of these earlier inquiries by professional bodies, regulatory systems, and local oversight mechanisms became a central focus of the Shipman inquiry. It highlighted the significant weaknesses in clinical governance, death certification, and the monitoring of medical practice. It might be very tempting to explain the Shipman case with a single word: evil. From a moral standpoint, this judgment may feel very satisfying, but from an ethical standpoint, it is insufficient. Ethics is not primarily concerned with identifying monsters and labeling people. It is concerned with understanding how harm occurs, especially when it occurs within systems designed to prevent it and by people who swear to protect you. Framing this case solely as the actions of an unusually malicious individual risks obscuring the deeper issue. I feel like the most difficult and important clinical and ethical question is, how was one doctor able to cause extensive harm over decades whilst operating entirely within the structures of a trusted, nationalized healthcare system? Harold Shipman did not work outside medicine. He did not bypass regulatory frameworks or practice covertly. He functioned as a licensed general practitioner, using the authority, discretion, and the trust that the medical profession necessarily confers on its members. The ethical problem, therefore, isn't simply what he did, but what the system allowed to happen. The Shipman inquiry made clear that the case cannot be understood as a failure of individual morality alone. It was a failure of multiple overlapping systems. Several structural weaknesses in GP practice and the NHS were identified. Death certification was inadequately scrutinized. Doctors were permitted to certify deaths of their own patients with minimal external review, even when deaths occurred at home and without recent clinical assessment. Controlled drug prescribing lacked effective monitoring. Shipman's access to diamorphine was not sufficiently tracked, and abnormal prescribing, excess amounts of diamorphine, these patterns were not flagged or acted upon in a timely manner. Mortality patterns in general practice were not routinely analysed or audited. There were no systemic practice mechanisms to identify unusually high death rates within a single practitioner's patient population. Professional deference discouraged challenge. Concerns raised by colleagues, patients, or relatives were often dismissed or softened due to assumptions of professional integrity and fear of undermining trust. Together, these failures reveal a system built on an implicit assumption that doctors, once qualified and registered, would consistently act in good faith. The ethical error was not that medicine trusted its professionals, it was that trust was treated as a substitute for oversight, rather than something that must coexist with it. Trust is fundamental to medical practice. Patients disclose intimate information, consent to invasive procedures, and accept life-altering decisions largely on the basis of trust in their clinicians. However, trust is not a control mechanism. Ethical systems are not designed on the assumption that all individuals will behave perfectly. Instead, they are designed to be resilient to failure, whether due to error, impairment, or bias, or in rare cases, deliberate harm. Any system that relies solely on professional virtue is ethically fragile. It places an unreasonable burden on moral character and provides insufficient protection when that character fails. The Shipman case demonstrates the consequences of unchecked professional autonomy. When discretion is wide, monitoring is weak, and accountability mechanisms are passive, harm can occur unnoticed for long periods of time. Ethically robust healthcare systems do not remove trust, but they support it with transparency, audit, and independent scrutiny. One of the most significant outcomes of the Shipman case was the recognition that reform was necessary, not to undermine doctors, but to strengthen the ethical foundations of medical practice. In the UK, this led to several key important changes, like the introduction of independent medical examiner systems, which ensures that deaths are reviewed by clinicians who were not directly involved in the patient's care. There is now stronger governance around controlled drugs in the hospital. This includes clearer accountability, record keeping, and oversight of prescribing and storage. There is now greater emphasis on clinical governance, audit, and data monitoring. This allows patterns of harm or outlier behavior to be identified and flagged up earlier. All these reforms are not expressions of mistrust in doctors. They were an acknowledgement of ethical reality, that even highly trusted professionals require systems that can detect problems early and respond effectively. In this sense, the whole legacy of the Shipman case is not simply a warning about one individual, it's a reminder that ethical medicine depends as much on good systems as it does on good people. Now, Harold Shipman is often remembered as an outlier, as a uniquely dangerous individual, but the enduring ethical lesson is much broader and important. Medicine is powerful precisely because it is trusted, and that is why it requires safeguards. Trust should never be blind, accountability can never be something optional, and that balance is what keeps medicine and patients safe. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.